Continuing our study on parenting, we're ready for lesson number 16, and we're no longer in the workbook. We have finished the workbook, so if you have that with you, that's fine, but we don't need it because we're not in the workbook any longer. We're adding 2 lessons at the end. We added 1 at the beginning, so that makes for our 17 lessons, and we split 1, so that's how we ended up with 17 lessons out of a 13-week workbook. Anyway, today we're going to talk about teaching children responsibility. Next time we finish up by talking about communication with children. So each time we try to give a rule that we think is a basic rule that has to do with rearing children. Many of these are broad spectrum in the sense. Some of them apply to the youngest of ages and sometimes to the older ages. But here's a basic rule I think that you'll agree with. Your self-image will likely shape your child's self-image. You agree with that? How so? Yeah, you're a product of your environment, absolutely. Yeah, Ezekiel 16:44, very good. So, yeah, you're stamping your imprint on the child. Yeah, these are very good comments. Yeah, if your child grows up with you as having this negative self-image and you talk that all the time, your child is likely to develop that same kind of mentality. The same thing if you have a positive self-image, they're liable to develop that same mentality. So rule number 21, your self-image will likely shape your child's self-image. All right, let's talk about teaching children responsibility. You didn't have a lesson to prepare or to develop, but I have a number of things we want to present, and we, particularly toward the end, if we have time, you can add some to this and help me develop this. One of the primary goals of parenting, I think we would all agree, is to rear children to become productive and responsible adults. In other words, all the teaching you're doing in those young years and the discipline you're doing is not just to make them better children, but your focal point is that you want them to be responsible adults. By that we simply mean the kind of adult that can make their own decisions, that's not dependent upon their parents to keep them up. That's what you want when they get to that age. We'll say more about that in a moment. The kind of adult that can be trusted, that will do and act as they should once they reach those adult years. The kind that would be an exception to the rule. You remember Paul told the Philippians that Timothy, and I'm paraphrasing, is different from those his age. Timothy about 30 years old at this point, somewhere in that age group. So we're not talking about a young child of 12. We're not talking about a 60-year-old man. We're talking about a 30-year-old man. And Timothy was a man that Paul said was different from everyone else in his age group. He's different from the rest of them. Is that, you see that in Philippians 2? And so you want to have a young adult, when they reach adulthood, that people look at and they think, you know what, that's the exception to the rule. They're above normal. They are superior to the others. And that's the kind of adult that you want. Now, all of that teaching responsibility, teaching them how to be responsible adults, starts at a very, very young age. 4 things we're going to see. Let's talk about teaching children responsibility being demanded in scriptures. Is there a passage that talks about that? Then we'll fast forward and look at the child in the future. And then we're going to raise what responsibilities need to be taught, and then how do you teach that? So those are the 4 areas where we're going. Let's talk about how this is demanded in scripture. What scripture would you cite if somebody said, I don't think we have to, I don't think God expects us to teach our children to be responsible? And your response is going to be to appeal to what scripture? Train up a child. Let's start with that one. Would you agree that it's included in Proverbs 22:6? Train a child in the way that he should go, so that when he's older, not depart from it. What do I want him to be as an adult? Has everything to do with what I'm doing now. So consequently, if I'm going to train them in the way they should go, and that means they need to be responsible when they get to be adults, then that passage demands that. Would you agree? All right. Any passage that talks about training children would imply that, would it not? What about bringing them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord? Does that demand some responsibility on their part? How can they follow the discipline of the Lord if they're not responsible? And so that's demanded by Ephesians chapter 6. Any passage on discipline, like the rod will drive it far from him, when you're correcting misbehavior, is also a passage that would demand you're teaching a child to be responsible. Would you agree? All right. Now, that's far from taking them to church all the time. You say, well, I taught my children, because I took them to church all the time, I taught them the difference between right and wrong. I told them lying is bad and drinking is bad, and I taught them all those stuff. And I gave them high moral standards. They don't engage in immorality like others do. And I taught them to be baptized. What I'm suggesting here is that teaching them to be responsible adults starts with teaching them to be responsible children, and that's far more than those things. Make sense? All right, let's go further. Now, we do it in a lot of these classes, we do a lot of pretending, and so let's just fast forward and pretend we can hit the fast forward button and look at our children. So let's just assume you have a small child, maybe they're a toddler. Let's fast forward now with our video, and let's look at that child in the future. So what do you want that child to look like when, for example, they reach middle school? What do you want, characteristics do you want them to have? What do you want them to look like when they're in high school? What do you want them to be like when they're a member now of the local church? They may still be at home, but they are a member of the local church. And they're under the oversight of the elders. And how do you want them to react to other members, to the elders, as their membership? How do you want them to react with reference to that? What about now they're off in college? How do you want them to behave? What about when they get a job, or what about when they get married? In other words, do you see your child at these various levels taking their assignments and their jobs seriously? Their school assignment, their college assignment, their job description, they take it seriously. Do you see them owning up to their own mistakes? Do you see them taking the blame for what they did? When they did something wrong, they just take the blame rather than shove it to the boss, to the teacher, to whoever. Do you see them as the kind of person that carries their own load rather than other people having to come in and carry the load for them? Do you see them as the person that could be trusted with a task, that the elders could give your child a task and it's going to be done? That the professor could give your child a task and it's going to get done? The boss could do the same thing. Do you see them starting without having to be pushed? Are others who are around them impressed with their responsibility they have? And so you fast forward and you say, that's what I want them to be. That's going to be important. Let's also fast forward. What if your child doesn't learn responsibility by the time they reach all of those areas? Let's fast forward and look at that bad picture. Do you see your child maybe blaming others, complaining about their tasks? They don't get their tasks done. They can't be trusted. Their word means nothing. They're always giving their word, but it doesn't mean anything. And people say that about your child. I know they say they will, but they haven't in the past, and so I don't have any confidence now. Are they not self-starters, self-disciplined? They're not reliable? Their mate has to carry their load? What if your child goes up and is married now, and their mate, male or female, has to carry the load for them because they're not carrying their part of the burden? Now, you say, well, what does that have to do with? Well, what can you do to instill responsibility is the question, isn't it? What can you do to do that? So one is be an example. We cited a moment ago, Drew did, Ezekiel 16:44, like mother, like daughter. In other words, you're their number one example. So you be responsible, and that's going to help you in teaching your children responsibility. But the other thing, and that's what the rest of the study is about, look at the future qualities or failures that you just saw and work to develop or to prevent those. Does that make sense? So in your mind, fast forward, what do I want this young adult? You say, well, my child's just 5 years old. Oh, got it. But that 5-year-old, if time prevails, is going to become a 15, and then a 25, and then a 35, and then on down the line. What do you want them to be at those ages? Then work to develop those qualities. And so those very same things we just mentioned, you say, I want my child to be one that carries their own load. Start that at 5 years old or earlier. Start that as a toddler, teaching them to carry their load. Taking the blame for what they did, owning their mistakes, taking their job seriously. Now, we're going to talk about how we do that here in a moment. All right. Now, don't get excited. We're moving fast, but these two sections are going to take a little longer to develop. So let's work through this. What responsibilities do we need to teach our children? I found an article that was entitled, Are You Teaching Kids Responsibility? 50 Sample Challenges to Get You Started. And the suggestion, which I thought was good, says, simply explain why the responsibilities are important to your child. In other words, you don't just tell them, here's a job you have, do it because I told you to, I got that. But talk to them about being given you responsibility. You're given more responsibility now because you're more mature. You're given more responsibility now because you can handle that responsibility. That these are important to the home. This is important to the family. We're going to develop that a little more in a moment. And furthermore, these are skills that you're going to need in your own home and in your own family later on. And furthermore, it's not just a matter we've got to clear the dishes and hang up the towels, etc. when we get through, but this is going to have an impact on you and your boss and you and your roommate if you're off in college, or when you have your children of your own, when you have a family of your own. Learn some responsibilities. Does that make sense? Explain to them what the value of that is. That's going to be helpful. All right, let's start with this. We need to teach children to do for themselves. Would you agree with that? That needs to be taught? And if so, why? Say again? Yeah, they're going to have to do for themselves sooner or later. Yeah. They start learning independence sometimes before we're ready for that. I want to do it myself. If you've had a little toddler, you understand I want to do it myself. So they develop that independence, but that's exactly what you want them to have is some independence. Yeah, you want them to have responsibility. You let them or you make them do what they're capable of doing. What do we mean by that? All right, that's true. But when they're capable of doing something, one writer suggested this. I like this thought. This is not original with me. That when we do things for them, we're sending a message they're not capable yet. For example, they're capable of cleaning their room, but it's easier for you to go clean their room. You're actually sending a message. You're not capable of doing that. I'll do it for you. Or it may be the matter of pick up your toys. They're capable, but it's easier for me to grab them up, put them in place, than to wait for them to get it done. But we're sending a message. You're not capable of doing that. And the child's learning, Mom will do that. Dad will do that. Because they're sending a signal, I'm not capable of doing that. See, if you do all the household and yard chores, you're telling the children you're not capable. The child's old enough to run the lawnmower, run the hedge trimmer, or run the weed eater, and you do all the work for them, and don't ever let them do that, they're sending a message, I'm not capable. I'm not capable of doing that. Make sense? Now this is interesting here. Don't do for them what they can do for themselves. And so some of you who haven't been here for the whole time, at the early start of our class, we made available this book, Training Up a Child by Gwendolyn Webb, in PDF form, and it's still available on our website if you're interested. She tells this story on page 202, so if you want to write that down and look it up in your book, have at that. There were psychologists that took two groups of rats. I don't know if you read this and remember this story, but the first group of rats the psychologists took, they guided them through this maze in a little wagon. They led them through the maze by pulling them through this maze in a little wagon. And at the end of the maze, they were rewarded with food. And they did that 20 times. The second group of rats, they turned loose at the beginning of the maze, and they had to learn their way, find their way through that. And when they got to the end, they were rewarded with food. And they did that 20 times. Then they took one rat from each group and turned them loose. And the one that had to work for their food is the one that got there first. Every time, I think it was 20 times they tried that. Every time they got there first. And what was the difference? Because one had been taught everything's done for me, and the other one had been taught they had to think for themselves. Interesting. Your children are the same way. Your children are the same way. You do things for them, and they're going to learn, you know what? I don't have to work. So we're not teaching them responsibility. Let them speak up for themselves, one writer suggests. In other words, let them talk to the teacher, ask the adult a favor, because that's a critical life skill. Very critical life skill. In other words, I can understand here's a little child that can hardly talk. The mother does the talking for them. But by the time that they're old enough, they can communicate and they want to go ask an adult a favor, let them do that. Let them talk to the teacher about the bad grade rather than you going and chewing the teacher out. Make sense? Let them do for themselves. Now here's a warning. Don't expect your child to do things at your level with your abilities when you're letting them do things. And furthermore, don't push them on the other end of the spectrum and hurry the child to the point you make a nervous, fretful wreck out of your child. I've known of parents to do that. Make sense? All right, that's one thing we want to teach them. We need to teach them to work. Why do we need to teach them to work? They're going to have to work at some point if they're going to have anything. Now, let's take a look at some passages that talk about abundant warnings about diligence versus laziness. And so we just want to hit the high points because I want to get to some other information. This passage says, if a man will not work, neither should he eat. All right. Colossians 3:23, whatever your hand finds to do, no, that's actually this one. Whatever your hand finds to do it with all your might. Colossians 3 said, whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord. In other words, be hard workers, be diligent workers. The Proverbs talks about go to the ant, you sluggard. Talks about the excuses, Proverbs 19, Proverbs 22, those two Proverbs. The man who won't put his hand to the dish and bring it back, he's so lazy he won't feed himself. Or there's a lion in the streets, remember that excuse? I can't go work if there's a lion in the streets. Warnings about laziness and how we need to be diligent. So your child needs to learn that life is not all playing, but it involves hard work. You see, if all my child understands is that we have fun, we play, and we have fun, and we have play, then they're going to grow up thinking, this is what life's about. They need to learn that life's hard work. They need to be given regular chores. Now, we'll get to the chores a little bit later. There are numerous studies. I think Webb cites one or two of these somewhere in her book. I didn't go back to find them, but I remember from years ago that those who are raised on a farm are often more compatible for marriage. Now, don't get excited. You say, I wasn't raised on a farm, and I think I'm quite compatible for marriage. That's not the point. The point is, you tell me, why would those raised on a farm be very compatible for marriage? Very simple point. If you were raised on a farm, you know. You know what it's like to work for someone. You had responsibilities, you had chores you had to do. Somebody had to go feed, somebody had to milk, somebody had to go see to the horses. Somebody had to maybe back in the day hook the mules and the horses up and plow. You had to get involved and you had to do something. You had to participate so that the family had food on the table. And so they're more compatible in that sense. Make sense to you? All right, yes. All right. Yes, sir. Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, what they're going to learn when they have jobs and chores, they're going to learn that there's rewards that come with that. I'm not going to take the time to get through all of that, except I want to come down here to the bottom of that. That the child is made to feel useful. Why is that important?
When they feel like they're needed or they're useful, then they have a sense of purpose or they want to do work, they want to try, they want to do things.
Absolutely. A child wants to feel like they're important and that they're needed. And so you give them some unimportant job and they're made to feel useless when they recognize this is something that I was just given to kind of keep me busy versus something that was really is important to the family. The child feels like they're needed. In fact, it may be simply as setting the table for dinner and you sit down to eat and the child will call attention. I set the table, I put the plates out because they realize that's important. We can't eat without those plates. Now, that might not be a big job for a teenager, but it might be a real big job for a 4-year-old, you see. I set the table. Big deal for them. They feel useful. All right, here's something else we need to teach them as far as teach them to be self-motivated and self-starters. What does that mean? Absolutely. Say that again loud enough. That's a good point. Say it again. Yeah. It's one thing to be driven, but another thing, they're self-starters. So you want to create children that are independent. They stand on their own 2 feet, that they don't always have to have things dictated to them, as Drew just suggested. And they don't always have to be pushed and constantly reminded. 2 Peter chapter 1 talks about self-control. And I think we often define self-control as I'm not going to lie. I've got self-control. I'm not going to steal. I'm not going to commit adultery. But self-control involves as much making yourself do what you know you need to do. Does that make sense? That's self-control too. And so I know I need to do this. Self-control means you make yourself do that. You control yourself. So you want to teach your child to be a self-starter, self-motivated. Do you agree with this, that we need to let them suffer consequences for not meeting responsibilities? Absolutely. You see, in life, everybody don't get a participation trophy. We think that's wonderful when two teams play and these little kids and everybody gets a trophy and they think they won. It didn't work that way in life, I'll tell you. And you know that from your job, etc. So they need to learn that if they don't study, they don't get their grade. When they don't practice, they don't make the team. When they don't learn, or when they don't work, they don't get paid. When they learn that principle, there are consequences to not meeting your responsibility, and they need to learn that starting at home. All right, you were told if you did this and you didn't do it, then you don't get the reward. It ain't going to happen. Stick to your guns on that. All right, they need to contribute to the family good. What does that mean? This is where they learn what a family means. Teach your child at a young age to contribute to the family good. In other words, they need to learn the family needs me, and I'm doing this for the family good. This is for the benefit of the family, like working on the farm a moment ago. I've got to help milk the cows. I've got to help feed the cows. I've got to help get the hay in because that's how we put food on our table. So I got to help with that. And so I'm contributing to the family good. So you might assign a child various tasks that the family needs them to do. I don't know what's needed in your family. I can figure that out for my children when they were small, but you can figure it out for yourself. This is something the family needs that I can assign to them, and they recognize and understand this is contributing to the family good. Does that make sense? We're teaching them responsibility. All right. Teach them to take ownership of the task or the jobs they've given. Don't mean to put you on the spot, Larry, but you use that term sometimes when we are dealing with, we're assigning tasks to deacons, and we'll say, you need to take ownership of that. What do we mean by that?
You actually have you're investing in your mind, your whole spirit is investing in that you want to do a good job and support that it's done correctly. And if it doesn't work, you take it personally. Fail. So whatever child is doing that, he needs to really care if it's clean. Needs to mind it if it's not. It's just a mindset.
Absolutely, absolutely. When you own the job, that just simply means, as Larry just said, you do it without having someone to look over your shoulder. When we're asking a deacon, you need to own this job. Now, if we as elders have to look over your shoulder, did you get it done? You're supposed to have that done last week. Have you got it done? You need to get to that. He doesn't own the job. Does that make sense? He needs to own the job. And the child needs to own the job without the parent looking over the shoulder. They see to the details of it without being micromanaged. That's the idea of ownership. They learn to do things on their own, take full responsibility without constant guidance. And so teach your child to be one that owns the task. You were given this task, you see to the details, you get it done, and don't have to come back every 5 seconds asking another question. You own the job. Make sense? So that's going to make them a good employee, going to make them a good student, isn't it? They're going to own the task, own the job. You want that kind of child. That's a good point. Teach your child to fish rather than give him a fish. There's an old saying, an old proverb that says, not a Bible proverb, but it's a Bible principle. You give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, and you teach a child to fish. Teach a man to fish, and you feed him for a lifetime. In other words, what we're saying here is teach your child some life skill, and then give him positive feedback, and turn them loose and let them do that. Does that make sense? If you constantly give your child a fish, then when you're gone, they're not going to eat fish. If you teach them how to fish, they've got all the fish they want. Does that make sense? And I'm not talking about fishing here. I'm not a fisherman. I'm not even interested in fish in that sense. I'm interested in this principle here that we're talking about. Now, let's spend the rest of our time, and it'll take the rest of our time, let's talk about how to give them responsibilities that they need. Now, one writer, I don't know that I fully agree with the assessment of that, of what I'm about to mention, but suggests you don't teach your child responsibilities, you give them responsibilities. Okay, think about that a little bit. Maybe so. I think you can teach them some responsibilities. All right, let's list some things here. Give them, set structure and goals with expectations. Think about that for a moment. Set structure and goals with expectations. Be clear and consistent. In other words, rather than you get up, you want your child to work on a Saturday, and you get up on a Saturday and it's just chaos and nobody knows what's going on, nobody knows what their task is. We're going to do something, but we don't know what we're going to do. Have clear goals. Set structure and goals with expectations. In other words, this is what is expected of you each morning before you go to school or before we start school or whatever the case may be. This is what is expected of you. This is what we want you to do. This is what the time we want you to do that. Routines help children learn to manage time and self-control. That's not original with me. I put it there because I think that's true. You agree with that? When your child has a routine, I got to get up in the morning, I got to make my bed, I've got to be dressed, and I've got to be at the breakfast table by X time. That's going to teach them time management and self-control. That kind of thing. Give advance notice of certain expected behavior. Here's what I expect you to do. For example, you may be going somewhere where things are a little different. Here's what we expect of you when we get there. Here's how we expect you to behave. Here's what I expect you not to do when we get to this place. Give them advance notice of expected behavior. And then they have now the responsibility of behaving. Does that make sense? We're going to a place that there's a lot of expensive glass things. Keep your hands in your pockets. Don't be touching, those kinds of things. Make sense? Give them advance notice of that. Set structure and goals and expectations. Now, this perhaps should have been the first thing I listed here. Make them obey. Webb, in this book that we've suggested, talks about a false sense of love, what she calls sentimentality, that has to do with, we call it love. In other words, we excuse the child's misbehavior, we let them have their own way, we grant whatever they want because we love them. And so they're having a fit, they want this toy, and we give in and let them have the toy that they're throwing a fit about. Make sense? They want to eat something that we told them they can't have, but we let them have it because we, quote, love them. And she says that's a false sense of love. We told them to behave and they're not behaving, but we cave, is the idea. Now let's go to Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 24. Someone read that for us, please. What are we learning about love and discipline? All right, I'm learning from that true love, finish my sentence. I learned from that passage, let me start over. I learned from that passage, true love disciplines the child. In other words, true love will be courageous and strong in making the child obey. You're going to obey. I told you not to, and that's what you're going to do, or suffer the consequence. See, that calls the child into account. I told you not to touch it. You touched it, you're being disciplined for it. That calls them into account. So they begin, the point is they're supposed to think next time when they're told not to touch it, I may get in trouble. I'm giving an account for that. So making your child obey is part of teaching them responsibility. So you look in the world, I'm not trying to analyze the whole world, but I think you would agree that you look around in the world in general, and we have a lot of adults that are irresponsible. That very well may be because as children, they were not taught to obey. Make sense? God knows what He's doing. God knows what He's doing. In other words, just follow the principle of God's law and we're going to be all right. All right, here's the third thing. about how to give responsibility. Pull back and let your child do what they've learned to do. Pull back and let the child do. In other words, when a child learns a new skill, give them freedom to use the new skill, whatever that skill may be. For example, when a child learns to walk, I don't mean the first day they learn to walk. They just hear at 12 months old, they learn to walk. And so you say, well, from now on you're walking. I'm not carrying it. That's not the idea. But once a child learns to walk, they can become more dependent on walking, and you can make them walk a little more to get the task done. Make sense? Instead of you going and getting them, make them walk to you. Or another illustration may be to put their own clothes on. They haven't learned that up to this point, but now they know how to do that. They can be given responsibility. You can dress yourself today. And so from now on, you're going to get yourself dressed. Here's the clothes. You get your, or maybe when they learn how to get their own clothes together, they can be responsible, or tie their shoes, etc. I'm just giving some illustrations to illustrate how once they learn a skill, you back away and let them use the skill they've learned. And that teaches them responsibility. Rather than, and I know this is simplistic, I know I taught you how to tie your shoe and you do well, but I'm going to tie your shoes from now on. They hadn't learned responsibility. Make sense? All right. It's often easier for us to do things for them rather than push them back into the territory of responsibility. Does that make sense? If you've read Gwendolyn Webb's book, she talks about mother bee and so forth, and she talks about getting out your stinger and driving your child back to where they need to be. They're not in their territory. They're not taking the responsibility. Drive them back over here and make them do their responsibility. I like that. You agree? Teach your child by pulling back and letting them do. Give them chores. Now that's why we talked about the farm a moment ago. Give them some chores. What would you say about giving them chores? Absolutely. Absolutely. The same author that I quoted a little bit earlier had this to say in her article that says a 2-minute action plan for fine parents. Get out a piece of paper or start a note on your phone and list the abilities and qualities you hope your child will have by the time they're 18. So here's some responsibilities I hope they have gained and know how to do by the time they're 18. Then she said backtrack and begin giving them chores that are going to develop those responsibilities. In other words, I want them to be able to handle money by the time they're 18 and know how to save money. Well, give them some chore, some responsibility teaches that, if that's what you're wanting them to learn. Make sense? I want them to do things on their own. We'll start giving them some responsibility where they learn that. So let's talk about giving them chores. And this is just a sampling. There may be more we could talk about. Like maybe the chore is you've got to put away your toys every night before you go to bed. Or you got to put all your books back on the shelf. Once you get all the books you want, but you got 20 books laying on the floor, you need to put them all up. Or you can't have a snack or whatever the case may be. Put their bikes up rather than leave them out. And the balls back where they belong. And put their clothes up. Hang them back up when you get home from church. Or make up the bed or clean the room or vacuum or dust or set the table or cook part of a meal or mow or trim and so on down the line. Take the trash out, weed the garden, etc. Can you add to that list of some samples? Yeah. Just take some responsibility. Use something, put it back. Go to the shop, use the tools, but put them right back. So put things away.
I think one principle is I try to teach my kids is you want them to do the job right the first time so they don't waste time or money or resources by having to redo it.
That's a good point. And I think that's part of the principle of Colossians 3:23. Whatever what is Colossians 3? If you misquote it, you can never get it right. Colossians 3:23. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might. That's Ecclesiastes. Whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord. That's what I'm after. And that had to do with a master a servant performing for their master. You work for them like you're working for the Lord. You do the best you can do. Even though he's a master and you're a slave, you do the best you can do. Best quality. So teach your children quality work. And that'll make them stand out in the workforce. What else would you add to that? Good point, Ricky. Do you see value in giving these chores to children? Giving them responsibility. And it may be simply the matter of taking out the trash, but that's not a big task, but a little later on, it's a bigger job. You've got to mow the grass every week for me now. You helped me before, but now you're going to mow it all. Or you got to go feed the cows, or you've got to go feed the horses, or you got to take care of the dog, or whatever. There's various responsibilities you can find you can give your child. Maybe there's extracurricular activities, and by that it may be your child is involved in sports, band, music lessons, etc. I'm just giving some examples. So what can they learn from that? You tell me. Your child says, I want to be in the band, and you have to buy an instrument and da-da-da-da-da. And so, or they want to take music lessons, and you buy them a piano, and you sign up for lessons. And what are they going to learn from that? Other than music. That's not what I'm after. Go ahead. Learn to be on time. Good point. Yeah. Submit to others. Absolutely. Yeah, they learn to take things seriously and the need to follow through. Your child's going to learn, and you may have this sometime where the child say, I want to take piano lessons, and they take them for a little while, I'm ready to quit. And you, no. We put too much money into it. You're going to take these till we get through the lessons, because this is what we do. We see our way through things. Same thing, you've signed up for this sport, you're going to play that sport. You're going to stay in that. You committed. Teach them commitment. They learn responsibility in extracurricular activities. Let them tag along with you. They learn by watching. Let them help as you work on the car, service the mower, repair the fence, cook a meal, work on the craft, sewing a dress, whatever. Let them watch you, and then let them participate. I learned a lot watching my dad. My dad let me tag along whatever we were doing. We built onto the house when I was in the 6th grade. I was probably the only 6th grader that had his own power tools. I'd bought power tools in the 6th grade. Had my skill saw and all my tools to build a house. I couldn't build a house, but I had the tools. That's where I learned. Tagging along, watching Dad. He had been a carpenter in his earlier years, in a short time, and that's where I learned a lot of that, is tagging along, watching him do everything he did, and decide, Dad, your old saw isn't much, I'll buy a saw. I'd saved up some money, and I took some money from a birthday or something and bought me a circular saw so we can build this house. You learn by tagging along, and you learn skills, and your children will learn something tagging along as well. Now, we mentioned this last time, and our time's running out, and I want to insert this here. Create work if needed. Create some work if needed. I told about the friend of mine whose dad raised cotton and a little patch that didn't make any money, and yet he said, I'm raising boys is what I'm doing. Well, same thing here. It may cost you a little money. It may cost you some time. It may be a task that doesn't absolutely have to be done, but you can create a job. I believe it was maybe in Webb's book, may have been another source, where a dad who didn't have much land went to a local farmer and said, would you hire my son to work for you? He'll be free labor. I want you to pay him, and I'm going to reimburse you whatever you pay him. So it won't cost you anything, it'll cost me. I'm wanting to teach my boy responsibility. And the farmer hired him. Well, maybe you can do something like that. Find some job, create a job if you have to, so that your child can learn, because you don't want your child to be leaving home and they haven't had any responsibilities or any kind of job. Make sense? Time is gone. We're done.